thank you. I'm so happy to be here to talk about something I really like, which is the Esopus Creek and the fisheries of the Ashokan Reservoir. My story is going to begin prehistorically and then come forward to about 2013. So obviously back at pre-colonial times, with the Native Americans being the only real indigenous people here, they were living off the land, obviously, and the landscape was really different than it is today. The species were a little different. It was mostly spruce and fir and birch and ash. The lowlands moving up the slopes were hemlock, northern hardwoods, including beech, birch, and maple. By the time New York City was developed, and really not fully developed, obviously, there were still some fisheries going in the city. And the first regulation in the New World actually for fisheries protection was in New York City in 1734. So if you think about that, it's over 280 years ago. There was a recognition that fisheries weren't sustainable at really high levels of fishing pressure. First settlers in the Catskills, well, they were probably living off the land also, and wild meat and game and fish were probably a good part of their diet. At that point, it was probably relatively sustainable. Shortly thereafter, I think there were a series of events that occurred that really had an impact. By the 1800s, the carriage roads were starting to get developed, and there were improvements that allowed tourism up in the Catskills and increased fishing pressure. And then as New York City's population grew even further and the advancements in transportation occurred, there were steam boats that came up the Hudson and dropped people off in Kingston. Carriage roads took them up into the Catskills from there. And then obviously later the railroads. The Catskills were really well known early on for sheer numbers of small trout, brook trout exclusively, and they were really high numbers. Reference to 6 guys going out and catching 1,300 brook trout in 2 days of fishing in the 1840s. Gives you some idea as to how abundant the fishery might have been up there at that time. By the 1840s and 50s, a combination of overfishing and changes in the forest landscape, the water quality, it all began to have its impact on the trout fisheries. The deforestation allowed for erosion and warming of the streams, acid factories, and then indiscriminate stocking of all different species of fish. Essentially, if you had a fish that you liked from the old country and you wanted to bring it over and you had the wherewithal to get it here, there was no problem with you stocking it here. And we ended up with common carp and really some fish that we hold kind of highly in regard today, such as the brown trout, which came from Europe, and the rainbow trout, which came from the western United States. They essentially took over a lot of the habitat that the brook trout once inhabited. Then we had a major shift in the habitat in the Esopus Creek, and I'm kind of jumping really far forward to the 20th century, where the Catskill system was built by New York City DEP. And the Esopus Creek was dammed and flooded, and part of the grand plan was to also build Schoharie Reservoir and pipe that water down into Ashokan Reservoir. And it really changed the flow regime for the Esopus Creek entirely. Sometimes it's 10, 20 times what the upper Esopus might have in it. And with that augmented flow, especially during those low periods of time, it also, in the summertime, it provided increased, decreased temperatures, which created a trout habitat all the way down to the Ashokan Reservoir in most years. It's interesting because some of the tributaries were maybe more famous for their fishing than the Esopus Creek itself. And probably because the Esopus Creek would get dry from time to time or get really warm in its lower stretches. All these purple lines are the tributaries. The blue line is the Esopus Creek. And just as simple as this is, it just represents how much habitat there is out there for spawning. And if a brown trout or rainbow trout is living down here and getting really large, they can come up and really, to a great extent, there's very few impediments to fish movement in this drainage. There's just a couple of dams, and there are some constrictions and some culverts.
So I'm going to change gears here and talk a little bit about climate and fisheries and what we may expect going forward. What I'm going to show you is the synthesis of the 30 leading climate models all kind of averaged together into one. The general predictions, and I will show you some details in a minute, but the general predictions are for Ulster County and the greater Catskills: warmer, wetter, but not consistently wetter at all months. We'll look at that in a second. And greater peak flows, so not only higher magnitude flows, but more frequent high flows. The average maximum temperature is projected to increase by 6.1 degrees Fahrenheit between the recent past and this future of 2050 to 2074. Precipitation. This to me is arguably the most interesting one. Same situation, so bad emission scenario and recent past compared to this 2050 to 2074. We see an increase in precipitation, an average of about 0.4 inches a month, which doesn't sound like much, but if you consider that over the course of a year, that's approximately 10 inches, and we get, what, 50, 60 inches a year in the Catskills. So you add that on, that's another 20% or so rainfall, so it is significant, I guess, in the annual context. Stream temperatures, of course, are not going to tick up at the same rate that air temperature is, right? Stream temperature is driven by groundwater inputs, by riparian shading. There's a lot of factors. So stream temperatures will certainly not increase at the same magnitude that air temperature will, but they are likely to increase to some extent. The increased precipitation that's projected could mean increased groundwater inputs and thermal refuge becoming even more of an important factor in sustaining our local trout communities. So groundwater temperature generally tracks the annual air temperature, so approximately 50, low 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we have increased or continued strong groundwater inputs in the face of a warming climate, this could really help mitigate some of the adverse effects on our fisheries. Now, these type of areas are incredibly important, and out west there's been a lot of research on these thermal refugia, and they can sustain great trout populations in streams where maybe, approximately 90+% of the stream habitat is unsuitable to trout in the summer. But if you get a handful of really good thermal refuge areas, either where there's a cold water tributary coming in or you have a nice groundwater seep coming in, these areas can sustain huge numbers of trout for these really stressful periods during the summer. I've seen photos where these refugia are just black with trout. I mean, trout are able to find these areas very successfully. From a conservation point of view, finding and protecting these areas to make sure that we don't inadvertently disturb them with restoration projects or highway work or whatever the case may be is extremely important for conservation. Interestingly, we've studied floods quite a bit, Irene being the most notable one in this watershed, and their effects on aquatic biota aren't always as severe as we would expect. We found that communities are extremely resilient. Not resistant. Resistant means that the flood doesn't even impact them. Resilient means they get hammered, but they come back quickly, and that's what our observation has been. Drought is kind of the silent killer that doesn't get talked about as much, which I'm actually more concerned about from a fisheries perspective. It's a little unclear what the trend is in drought. It does follow that we're going to have warmer summers. We're going to have about the same amount of summer precipitation. You combine those two things, it only seems reasonable that drought could become a greater factor. Some summary thoughts on how our fisheries might be affected going forward. We expect brown trout, well they already are actually, we've seen this in places in the Neversink, to encroach further upstream into the brook trout strongholds. Non-native and warm water fish species such as smallmouth bass may start working their way up the main stem a little further. This is an interesting one. Portal waters may become increasingly important for sustaining the main stem. Forest pests, you could have had a whole talk on that. I certainly wouldn't be the person giving it, but forest pests are likely to affect our canopy. Hemlock woolly adelgid, of course, being potentially the most dangerous as far as fish and stream temperatures go, but emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, you could probably name 6 or 8 others. So they're going to potentially affect our riparian canopy and affect nutrient cycling as well in ways that maybe we can't even fully anticipate. And with that, I'm going to hand back off to Mike, and he'll take us down the home stretch here.
Some of the tools that we use and that we're currently continue to use, we're focused a lot on habitat. We have all sorts of regulations and rules that protect stream beds and banks. We regulate discharges and water withdrawals. We're trying to do what we can, and certainly through groups like the Ashokan Watershed Stream Management Program, working with best management practices within the watershed with stormwater runoff, which causes increased flushes of warm water coming into streams and silt and turbidity sometimes. want to see barriers removed if at all possible. But I do have to say, in this case with the removing barriers, there could be a place and time when a barrier actually may be a good thing when you're talking about brook trout, because as we were talking, the rainbows and brown trout, if they can't get up to a spot where we have just brook trout, that barrier may be worth maintaining in some instances. So, but for the most part, we want to see barriers removed and open things up for spawning fish. And reconnecting the floodplain, I think, has been pretty clear how important that can be, where you need the river to be able to spread out so that it can, cause less damage during big flood events. If you constrict it through berms or other infrastructure that's narrowing your stream, it's just going to create this high velocity that'll just rip things up downstream. So in the future, what we're going to be working on, sort of going back to that last slide, all this stuff, we're going to continue our stocking, we're going to continue habitat protection, improving access. But the work that Scott has just gone through is a great example of why we really need to have kind of annual sampling so that we can see how one flood or one drought affects things. If that could be recreated over time, if we have 15 years worth of data rather than 7 or 8, if every time there's a flood in the fall or a drought in the fall, you have the same sort of impact, results, that's going to start to really make things clear on how the system is functioning. There's a study that Ashokan Watershed Stream Management Program just funded where over 100 individual sites within the upper Esopus watershed are going to be monitored with temperature probes. That example that Scott had for the thermal imaging, which is a different technique entirely, but it illustrated how important those little thermal refuges are. With 100 sites in the watershed, maybe we'll find some of those and focus on where some of the groundwater inputs are coming. That could be very helpful, I believe, for the future. We also have an ongoing, this is the second year of a 2-year study that we're doing in Region 3, where we're going out looking for the presence and absence of brook trout throughout the whole region. And I think we did 500 different surveys last year, close to it, different individual sites throughout the region. Most of those streams, we know there are brook trout up in the upper parts. And if we can, figure out that distribution a little bit better, it may be really interesting to track going forward with any sort of climate change that occurs. And changes within the watershed is, with the woolly adelgid and the potential for defoliation of some of the trees and opening of the canopy, that could raise the water temperatures in some of these streams too. So it'd be good to have sort of some base data that we can go by.